All right, moving over to the lightweight division now. We got Mateusz Gamrot coming in at minus 180, going up against Esteban Ribovics, who comes in at plus 155. Now, Gamrot is coming off that short notice main event loss against Charles do Bronx Oliveira from back in October. And that was a fight where I thought, the improvements that we saw in his fight against Ludovic Klein would help him against Oliveira, specifically his knack for actually dishing out damage now. We saw in his fight against Dan Hooker, which was a split decision loss, he accrued a bunch of control time, landed a bunch of takedowns, but he wasn't landing enough damage, and that's what the judges ended up scoring for Hooker, hence why Gamrot ended up coming up short that night. But in the Ludovic Klein fight, we saw Gamrot much more intent in terms of landing damage, even with the smothering grappling game we've come to know from him. But against Oliveira, he could have no success. Oliveira showcased great takedown defense, good reversals, great strength of his own, and then the obvious striking edge that Oliveira held in that matchup. And then we saw Oliveira get that second round submission over Gamrot. Now, Gamrot may not be that title challenger that a lot of people expected him to be when he first came into the UFC, but he is still evolving as a fighter even at 35 years old. His smothering wrestling game with his chain wrestling and going from one takedown attempt to another is still very difficult for a lot of fighters to deal with. He leaves a lot to be desired in the striking realm, usually just throwing a lot of flashy kicks to eventually get in on a takedown attempt or initiating the clinch. And from there, all he needs is an ankle and he'll find a way to get to the rest of his takedown attempts. And it's very hard for a lot of opponents to get away from that. And he's very good in terms of implementing that style. He has a pretty damn good UFC record still, even though he's 3-2 over his last 5 fights. I'm sure if he got that Dan Hooker fight again, he'd adjust a few things and that would be enough for him to get over the line. And I think he showed those adjustments in the Ludovic Klein fight. Now, he's going up against a better striker here in Esteban Ribovics, who's coming off of a very dominant decision victory over Elvis Brenner, a fight where I believe I had him as a lock of the night play. Now, it was a little bit chalky, but I expected that fight to be one-way traffic, and I expected Ribovics to get Brenner out of there. But Brenner stood tall. Brenner had little to no success in that fight other than the fact that his chin held up and ate as much damage as he did. But I thought it was quite obvious once the scorecards were being read that Ribovics was going to get his hand raised. He's a very clean, crisp striker with big power in his hands. He has massive confidence, especially during the run that he currently has. Even that loss that he had to Nasrat Haqparast, I took some Haqparast in that fight because I felt the line was just a little bit off there. And when the decision for that fight was being read, I was a little bit skeptical that I'd get the win that night or not. And luckily I did, but there was a good enough argument that Ribovics deserved to win that fight. He fell short in his UFC debut, giving up 11 takedowns to Loik Radzhabov, but he's now 4-1 over his last 5, and he's only given up 1 takedown on 15 attempts since that Radzhabov fight. So it's clear that he's improving that aspect of his game, knowing that he needs to go out there and strike to try to knock his opponents out and try to get them out that way. But he's definitely a prospect to keep your eye on. Now, I got to say, I'm very surprised that the UFC is putting this type of matchup together, especially for a rising prospect like Ribovics. He's 29 years old. He has an entertaining fighting style, and he has a market with Argentina that could be a good enough market to, take a fight card down there and have him be the anchor. You have a couple other guys. Kevin Vallejos is making a lot of noise. You got Francisco Prado earlier on this card. If he's able to get a win this weekend, they have a good stable of Argentinian fighters they can take over there. Eileen Perez, who's also streaking as of late. But to put Ribovics against a guy stylistically who's a bad matchup for him makes no sense. Gamrot, he should be able to get to his grappling here. I think even though Ribovics holds enough of a striking edge, I think Gamrot can still get to his takedowns. I think he'll push enough of a pressure here that Ribovics will be uncomfortable. I think Ribovics will start to be a little bit gun shy as we get into rounds 2 and 3. And even though he shucked off 14 out of 15 takedown attempts over his last several fights, Gamrot is another level of grappler compared to what he's been facing as of late. So I'm going to go Gamrot here, but even at minus 180, I'm a little bit skeptical because of the striking edge of Ribovics. And if he can, if Ribovics does not settle for bad positions and he continuously works back to his feet and lands enough damage, he could easily steal this fight back in his favor as well. So very sketched out about this matchup. I'm still going to go Gamrot. I'll lean on his grappling. I'll lean on his experience. And I think that's going to be enough for him to go out there, grind this fight out, and win it on the scorecards.